I'm going to put the scriptures up here for you as we read along with this. To me, we're going to read out of the book of John today, John chapter 9. This is a story about a miracle. To me, this is one of the most fun stories there is in the entirety of the Bible. There's humor and tragedy both in this story. I love reading the story. We're going to go through the whole narrative. It's an interaction between Jesus and a man who had been born blind, and see what Jesus did in his life. Again, a miracle takes place when it's an impossibility for man. When you can't fix your health, when you can't fix your marriage, when you can't fix your finances, when there's something unfixable by the hand of man, how many of you know that's the opportunity for God to make a miracle happen? That our tragedies become God's opportunities. Our tragedies become God's opportunities to do amazing things in homes, in bodies, in finances, in businesses, all around our lives. God wants to display and demonstrate his power. That in fact, your life becomes a palette that God begins to paint a picture upon, and he paints a beautiful picture to show the world how amazing he is, and he does it through us. That's what's astounding to me, that God would use my life, my mortal life, to display the wonders of God. And all of us are candidates to do that very thing, and we're going to see that happen in the life of a man today. So if you brought a Bible, you want to follow along, we're going to go to John chapter 9, beginning in verse number 1. We're going to read the story. I'll kind of explain it as we go along, and we're going to bump right up against the next service. Just a heads up on that whole thing. John 9:1 says this: as Jesus was walking along, pause with me for a moment. Let's go to Jerusalem. Let's go to one of the main streets in Jerusalem, the city center where all the people would be bustling about, kind of like standing in the midst of the Mall of America. Hundreds of people all over the place. Jesus is there with at least his 12 disciples with him. I would imagine a crowd following Jesus, because wherever Jesus went, he's like a rock star, and people want to see what Jesus is going to do. As he is walking along, John says he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Jesus saw him. I would imagine that the blind man is seated somewhere alongside the road. He's there maybe playing guitar, has his guitar case out, and people are throwing in their nickels and dimes as they walk past. What other kind of a living could the blind man hope to have? It was a life of destitution, a life of hopelessness as he sat along the roadside. And with all of the people walking past, Jesus saw what nobody else saw. They had seen this blind man there probably so much that he was a part of the fixture of the street of Jerusalem. They no longer saw him, and so Jesus notices him. Now, not only did Jesus notice him, I would imagine as he's walking along and he stopped, and I think he just stared at the man for a little while. As did the disciples with Jesus. They saw that something had caught the attention of Jesus, and so they decided they would look too, and they noticed the man there was blind as well. And I think Jesus' heart was moved with compassion, as we'll see in a moment, but the disciples decided that there's kind of a philosophical discussion that we could start as we look at this blind man. Look at verse number 2. Rabbi, his disciples asked him. I would imagine probably only one verbalized the question, but all of them were thinking the same thing. Why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? See, the thinking must be that, well, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Or they might have gone all the way back to the Old Testament law that God says, I'll visit the sins of the fathers to the third and the fourth generation. So maybe they're just thinking based upon that somebody in the family must have sinned here, and that's why he was born blind. I mean, that's why the tragedy took place. And Jesus answers their question. Verse number 3, he says, well, it wasn't because of his sins or his parents' sins. Jesus didn't deny that there was, in fact, yes, there's sin, but that's not the reason why this man was born blind. Here's the reason. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. Whatever tragedy might come to our lives can be an opportunity for God's power to be seen in you. It happens so that God's power can be seen in our lives. It is not about my comfort. It is not about lifting up my name. It's not so that I can have a story to tell and be published in a newspaper or a magazine. It's about declaring the power of God, to tell the world around us there's a living, loving God that still does miracles today, and we should expect a miracle to happen at Walmart, at the grocery store, at the gas station, in our home, in the church, out in the sidewalks, in the streets, in the neighbors next door, wherever it should be. It's an opportunity for God to display his wonders. That's the God that we serve. Don't get too excited, okay? Just saying. There's times, church, when we grow hopeless. because our situations look hopeless. But hopelessness is an opportunity for God to display His glory. Our tragedy is an opportunity for God to do something great. Jesus now does a little teaching with the disciples. Verse 4, we must quickly carry out the task assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming and then nobody can work, but while I'm here in this world, I am the light of the world. Jesus is our hope. Jesus is our hope. And Jesus is saying, you know what? There's an opportunity presented to you when somebody has the need to be healed or they need a miracle in their life. That is your opportunity. You're bringing the light of Jesus Christ to their dark world. Make the most of every opportunity. I can tell you probably more regrets about missed opportunities than I can about one where God did something amazing. I remember years ago when I was here as a youth pastor going through the line over at now Cashwise Foods. It was then Family Thrift Center. If you remember Family Thrift Center, you're old, just saying. And we're standing in the line and this beautiful little girl is behind the checkout desk and my wife says to her, it must have been a long day because you get to sit on a stool and do the checking. She said, no, I have juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. My heart was stricken with compassion. Faith rose up inside of me. I wanted to reach across and put a hand on her shoulder and pray for her. I knew in my heart that Jesus could do a miracle in that moment. But you know what happened? I took a second look and people started gathering in our line. We were the only ones there. Then people started coming. And fear. I was afraid. What are people going to think if I'm praying for this girl and they got to wait a little longer to get their milk through the grocery line? And I missed it. And all these years later, I still regret not making the most of the opportunity. Well, the story goes on. Verse number 6, Jesus does something amazing. Look at this. Then Jesus spits on the ground because his mama wasn't there, okay? Jesus spits on the ground. And he made mud with the saliva. How many want Jesus to heal you like this? We've all smelled saliva. We know what it's like. It's gross. And Jesus spits in the ground. Can you see this? And I don't know if the beggar had stood to his feet by now, but Jesus spits on the ground, reaches down, and I think he begins to kind of roll it to make a poultice in his fingers. And here's what I'm thinking. The Bible doesn't come out and say this, but here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking this guy doesn't have any eyes in his head. Because Jesus now, with the mud on his thumbs and his fingers, goes to this blind man, and the reason that I think he didn't have any eyes, I'm just speculating, don't take my word for this, is that this is like a creation story. In Genesis chapter 2, God created man out of what? The dust of the earth. And I'm thinking Jesus is going to create something here. The man has no idea what's about to take place, so he takes the mud. If he had eyes in his head, I would hope he had his eyes closed before Jesus starts rubbing dirt in the eyes. But Jesus spreads the mud inside all over this guy's eyes. He could feel something there. The hands of Jesus touched. Now there's mud on his eyes. I don't know how thick the layer of mud, but nonetheless, he's got this mixture of saliva and dirt on his eyes. Jesus says in verse number 7, go and wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent, and Jesus was sent to us. Now, the pool of Siloam is a fascinating place. You can still see it today. It still exists. It's near where the temple would have been in old Jerusalem in the days of Jesus. I think it was built by Hezekiah. It was fed by a spring that was a quarter mile away. They built this aqueduct that ran underground and fed this thing. It was a large pool. It was cool water that flowed into the pool of Siloam. It was a place where people would gather in the heat of the Mediterranean sun and maybe refresh themselves with the cool water from the pool of Siloam. Children would splash and play on the water. There was stone-cut steps that led up to it, and then steps that went down into the waters. You could sit on the steps. You could step into the waters. And Jesus said, go now, wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. And so somehow or the other, we don't know the distance that Jesus and this man was from the pool, but somebody had to get him there, leading him through the masses and the crowds to near where the temple would have been. People would have been there to worship. It was the busiest, most populated place in the city of Jerusalem in that time. He's just being obedient. He has no idea what to expect. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine this? As he would kneel down to the pool, maybe he got in, but I just visualize in my mind, and he can hear the children playing. He can hear the sounds that he's heard his entire life. But he's never seen the source of those sounds. He gets down and splashes in the cool water and splashes on his eyes. And then he splashes some more, and suddenly there's an experience that he's never experienced before. He can see light that he's never seen before because he's been born blind. He washes some more in the water, and he washes more in the water. And with every splash of water on his eyes, as the mud falls out of his eyes, he can see. I would imagine that the normalcy of whatever was taking place at the pool that day was suddenly interrupted by a guy saying, I can see, I can see, I can see, I can see. Yeah, big deal. I mean, what do you do? I can see. The guy's excited. Well, what would you do? I know you're German and Norwegian. Yeah, I can see. Yeah, I can see. The rest of verse number 7 says, so the men went back. He washed and he came back seeing. Can you imagine this guy running through the streets of Jerusalem? I can see, I can see, I can see. Hey, I can see you. Nice shirt. I can see that it's on your chin. I can see, I can see. The guy would have been excited. All the normalcy of Jerusalem interrupted by this one guy's miracle. Can you imagine that? When we read these stories, I think we need to place ourselves right there. Caused quite a ruckus and quite a stir. Verse number 8. Oh, we've got a lot of verses to read still. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar, they knew him in the past. They knew what he was. Asked each other, isn't this the guy that used to sit and beg? Verse 9, some of them said he was. Others said, nah, he just looks like him. To me, this is so hilarious. Nah, he just looks like him. I don't think he's the right guy. He says, but the beggar was saying, I'm the guy. It's me, but I can see. I can see. And he's just going berserk. Verse number 10, they asked, well, who healed you? Here's the amazing thing. They're missing it. Instead of standing there going, you can see, I can see, yay! And they start cheering like Chicago Bears fans. They're just going, well, how this happened? Who did this? In verse number 10, they says, well, who healed you? What happened? He told them, well, this man that they called Jesus, he made mud, he spread it over my eyes, and then he told me to go wash in the pool and wash yourself. So I went and I washed, and then I can see. Right. They totally miss it. Look at verse 12. Where is he now? I don't know. Verse 13 and 14. Oh, then they took the man who had been born blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath. It's on a Saturday that Jesus made the mud and healed this guy. Now the story takes a turn to the darker side. If you were watching the movie, the music becomes more sinister now because the Pharisees were involved. And every time Jesus got involved in the life of the Pharisees weren't bad guys. They wanted to really get back to the truth and the power of Scripture, but they became so focused on the law and the rules and just everything is black and white that they missed the power of Jesus. And Jesus loved to just interrupt their day and say, hey, let me do something to shake you up a little bit. So now they're going to bring this guy before the Pharisees because it's a Saturday. It's a Sabbath, the day you're supposed to rest. When Jesus does this, verse 15, the Pharisees asked the man all about it, and so he told them, he put mud over my eyes, and when I washed it, I could see. The amazing thing again about this is Jesus didn't say, go wash in the pool and you'll be healed. He said, go wash. It was obedience to the compassion of Jesus. Now the Pharisees want to find out how the whole thing, he made mud, spread in my eyes, I washed, I could see. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, well, this man Jesus isn't from God, for he's working on the Sabbath. Others said, well, how could any ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? And so there was deep division even amongst them. Jesus is on trial before the Pharisees. I submit to you that Jesus is still on trial today. Because some people believe that Jesus is the Messiah and still does miracles today, and others don't. And you have to answer the question for you. Students, listen to me. It's not mom and dad's faith. This is your faith. You better know what you believe and why you believe it. When you walk the hallways of your school, you better know why Jesus is still the Messiah, why he's your Messiah. You better know why and be able to defend it, because Jesus is on trial in your school. Most people believe that there's a Jesus, but Jesus is some figure in ancient history. He was, but he isn't now. He maybe is now, but he doesn't care now, because look what's going on in the world. And so Jesus is still on trial, and he's on trial this day. And sometimes when Jesus steps into our lives, he messes with our theology. He doesn't fit into our box. If Jesus was here today, I don't know, he couldn't spit and he could make mud, I suppose, out of the carpet because he's Jesus, but we'll do something that just rocks our world. It doesn't fit our mind. Verse 17, the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind many times. Do you see what John says? Had been blind, had been blind, had been blind. What's your opinion about this man? Who healed you? And the man said, well, I think he must be a prophet. Verse 18, the Jewish leaders still refused to believe that the man had been blind and now he could see. And so now they wanted verification. So you know what they do? They call in his parents. They ask him, was he born blind? If so, how can he see right now? Verse number 20, mom and dad kind of throw the kid under the bus. Look what they say. Well, his parents replied, well, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. Now, the reason they say this is found in verse 22. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anybody saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. And that's why they said, he's old enough. Ask him. In other words, you know what? Mom and dad were more concerned about social standing than about the glory of God. Mom and dad cared more about other people's opinion. They were the ones standing in the checkout line, worrying about what people would think if they raised their hand and prayed for somebody. They were the ones who were standing there more concerned about how they appeared to people than how they appeared to the living God. May it never be said of us the same thing. Verse 24, so for the second time, they called in the man who'd been born blind and told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner. Now, I love, this is where the story is hilarious to me. The Pharisees think Jesus is a sinner. The guy does not want to get into any kind of a theological debate with him. The guy who had been blind, but is now probably just boinging around like a spring because he can see. See that? See that? Did you see that? I know how many lights there are in here. Did you see that? Did you see? Oh, and he's just going on and on. They want to get theological. Look at verse number 25. I don't know whether he's a sinner, the man replied, but I know this. I was blind and now I can see. Really doesn't matter your opinion of it. I was blind, now I see. Really doesn't matter a whole lot. Verse number 26, but he says, but what did he do? They asked. How did he heal you? Verse number 27, look, the man exclaimed, I told you once, didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be one of his disciples too? And all the Pharisees blew up like bombs, just like give me a little paper cut and throw lemon juice in it, right? I love it. This guy, he just in total innocence is asking them the question. And then the Pharisees, verse 28, they cursed him and said, you're his disciple, but we're disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know that where this guy comes from. Now, the guy takes him to task. This is what I love. This is the blind guy. You know what's amazing? It's amazing when people aren't necessarily, when they can't see things, you listen to things. And I bet this guy heard a lot of conversation. I bet he heard a lot of different things, and he heard a lot of things about Jesus. So verse number 30, he says, well, he's speaking now to the Pharisees, verse 30, well, that's really strange, the man replied. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from. Like, hello? You know? Should be pretty obvious that he's probably from heaven. Verse 31, well, we know that God doesn't listen to sinners, the guy who's blind, born blind says. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship and do his will. In other words, he's saying, you know what, there's people that live totally disobedient to God, want nothing to do with him. Why should God listen to them? But he goes on to say, he says, ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. Well, that's a true statement. Verse 33, if this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. It was an impossibility with man. Doctors could not remedy this blind man's situation. Verse 34, the Pharisees say, well, look, you were born a total sinner, they answered, and you're trying to teach us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. In other words, it was pretty hard. Here's this guy that was born blind. The proof is there. The verification is all there. The Pharisees just can't handle the truth. And so we'll just try to ignore the truth and just kick him out of the sanctuary. And can you imagine this guy walking out of the place where the Pharisees go, I can see, and he's dancing about. And somewhere along the line, Jesus gets a little private moment with him. In verse 35, when Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and he asked him, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe in the Son of Man? Just not this mental assent. Do you believe it here? Do you believe in the Son of Man right here? Do you believe it here? You got to believe it. How many of you believe that tomorrow morning, just after 8 o'clock, the sun is going to rise above the horizon? Nobody's going to go to bed tonight and say, oh God, I beg of you, please let the sun rise tomorrow. Oh God, I just don't know if the sun's going to come up. We know the sun is going to rise tomorrow. We believe the sun is going to rise. It's as natural as the next breath that you're going to take. And so it should be to believe in the miracles of Jesus. That Jesus can still do the miraculous today. It should be that natural. We should expect it just the same as we expect the sun to rise tomorrow morning in Williston, North Dakota. It should be so natural. Can Jesus change your life? Can Jesus change your marriage? Can Jesus heal a body? Can Jesus change your circumstances? Can Jesus reverse the effects of disease? Can Jesus change the impossible situation that you face today? And I believe that he can. Do you believe in Jesus? And that was the question that he had for that man that day. In verse number 36, the man answered, who is he, sir? He'd never seen Jesus. He didn't know who he was. He didn't recognize him as a Messiah. Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. What about you? Do you want to believe in Jesus? Verse 37, you have seen him. I love it. Jesus said, you've seen him. I'm right here. You've seen him, he said. He's speaking to you. Verse 38, finally the end of the story. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said. And he worshiped him. Stand to your feet with me today, church.